Folks, I am here to tell you that it's all okay. There's a lot of discourse out there, times are tough, but you know what? You don't gotta listen to any of it. You don't even need to know what an amazing digital circus is. Instead, you can join me in hyperfixating on direct-to-video sequels to a 40-year-old mecha show no one talks about anymore. This is the way, people. This is the thing to do. Because I come bearing beautiful news. Armored Trooper Votoms is relevant again, finally. The end of this year, we will have the first animated Votoms entry in like 10 years, directed by frickin' Mamoru Oshii. Votoms is back in Pog form, folks. It's called De Grå Hexe, the Grey Witch. It's the first of 2 movies, and everyone's going to get into Votoms. This time next year, people will be cancelling each other over whether or not they understand the Votoms subtext. And before that happens, don't you want to beat them to the punch? Don't you want to know what this thing is all about? I watched the original Votoms, a 1983 51-episode series from Sunrise, directed by Ryosuke Takahashi, when I first got into mecha anime. That would have been around 2008, so I would have been about 14. And the show at that time had a good reputation among a certain kind of elder anime fan. This was the real stuff, they told you, the hard stuff, the grittiest of mecha grit. In retrospect, I'm not sure that reputation is the best way to frame Votoms, because this is also a series with its own vein of sincere melodrama, but I also can't say it was without any truth. Votoms has a noticeably grimy aesthetic, and not just from its central mechs. The world has this industrial vibe that is clearly informed by American science fiction from the period, with Alien seeming like the clearest influence on the ships and environments. I wish I could say that it was love at first sight for me, but I think as a teenager I respected the series more than I emotionally responded to it. Takahashi's Dogram, at that time basically not discussed at all in fandom, ended up being the work from his filmography that I really went to bat for, and otherwise I had the obsession of Gundam to dominate most of my adolescent brain, as well as my obsession of Evangelion and Imagawa's works, a lot of stuff. All of that is to say, there were a lot of important, respected mecha texts vying for my attention at the time. I finished the Votoms series and I respected it, but I didn't feel a strong emotional connection. It didn't feel mine in the way a lot of those other works came to. Do you know what I mean? There's this relationship you build with media as an adolescent where when it really connects, it becomes part of you in some way. And I think that's doubly true with mecha, where there's so much history and so much of it is arcane in the way it responds to itself. You kind of feel like you're being inducted into some esoteric order when you start watching these shows. Anyway, this year, 2026, now 32 years old, I revisited Votoms, and there was a surprise waiting for me. That being that I actually really responded to it this time. Takahashi constantly describes the series in interviews as being about a kind of wounded Vietnam War veteran, the main character Kiriko as someone basically unsocialized, trying to come to grips with his reality. And on this viewing, that really hit me quite hard. When I got to its conclusion, which at 14 I mainly understood as esoteric, this time I found myself tearing up. But anyway, when I finished the series in 2008 or 2009, I wasn't in any rush to check out the myriad of Votoms OVAs. But I did know they existed, and they were always on the list, so to speak. They had to me what YouTuber Tor High Heels would describe as a mysterious quality. Like, what even are these anyway? They aren't Gundam-style side stories. They mostly all seem to have the same cast as the original. And so many seem to be prequels, but then, wait, what, there's this sequel too from 1994 with the pretty rad name Brilliantly Shining Heresy? And it's got like a whole new visual style, and it looks kinda gorgeous, like if there was a 90s anime Warhammer 40k adaptation. And then there's another sequel, but it took like 20 years to materialize? Why does no one talk about these? Having seen now every piece of Votoms animated content that there is, I injected it all into my veins over the last couple of weeks. I can tell you the reason, the secret, arcane truth of why no one talks about these. They're kinda bad. They're not very good. Which, you know, in itself is sort of interesting. Even speaking as sort of a casual fan of this franchise, it's clear to me that the original Votoms is one of the best mecha anime ever made, and no other Sunrise mecha series has as many OVA entries as this other than Gundam, stretching from the 80s until the early 2010s. So what went wrong? Why can I not really recommend the vast majority of these works? I usually try to keep spoilers to a minimum, but in this video I want to chart what these OVAs do with the original show and the narrative decisions they make. And so for that purpose, I think I do need to establish basically what happens in the original from beginning to end. I am also pretty terrible at plot synopsis. I avoid it mostly in my videos for that reason, so bear with me. But from here on out, I'm going to establish what the original show is actually about. And from here on out, there's going to be major spoilers. So if you don't want to hear those, this may not be the video for you. So, Votoms takes place in the galaxy of Astragius, where two sides, Gilgamesh and Balarant, have been at war so long neither knows why the conflict began. The series begins as that war is coming to an end, with the elite soldier Kiriko sent on a covert mission to recover a strange piece of cargo. It ends up being that well-worn sci-fi archetype where, oh what, the cargo is this mysterious, ethereal woman, Fianna. And Kiriko doesn't really know what's going on, but he soon realizes, wait, this mission is against his own side, and after they get Fianna, his own teammates start firing at him, and he's on the run. He's been inducted into some sort of military conspiracy. The series then follows him across several arcs and planets as he tries to recover Fianna from her handlers and find out what is going on, all the while hiding out from his own military. In the first arc, he becomes a battler, essentially a mecha boxer, in the Blade Runner-inspired city Uwudo. And there he meets his soon-to-be friends, Goto, Vanilla, and Kokona. They serve as the comic relief in this otherwise fairly po-faced story. Eventually, Kiriko learns that Fianna, as well as himself, are perfect soldiers, a kind of supernaturally capable and lucky being, sort of Votoms' equivalent to Gundam's new types. Everything escalates considerably in the final arc, God Planet Quent, where Kiriko discovers that the entire galaxy, the war between the two sides, and most of the events of the series have been manipulated by an ancient artificial intelligence known as the Wise Man. Wise Man has been testing Kiriko, making him the enemy of the universe, because it believes that this ordeal will forge him into someone capable of inheriting its power, essentially turning him into the new Godhead. But once Kiriko reaches Wiseman, he quickly decides to shoot that techno AI god right in its lens, rejecting its power. The end of 2001: A Space Odyssey is homaged, with him removing Wiseman's databanks until it self-destructs. At the end of the show, with Gilgamesh and Balarant about to go back to war, Kiriko and Fianna decide to seal themselves in a cryogenic pod. They're like, peace out, don't use us as weapons, only wake us up when a galaxy without war exists. And their companions are left behind, alive and well. So quite a lot of ideas are dealt with here, and each arc has its own aesthetic, some of which are more space operatic, and some of which are more kind of boots on the ground. My favourite arc is the second, Kumin, in which Kiriko becomes a gun for hire in a small conflict on this isolated jungle planet. I probably like this one the most because in some ways it's the closest to Takahashi's preceding series, Dogram, in that it's less about Kiriko as an existential runaway, and more about a specific conflict and the various players within it. And just as Dogram pulls from North African liberation movements and the film Battle of Algiers, this arc takes much of its aesthetic from Vietnam cinema, with Apocalypse Now in particular really being utilized a lot. It also has the kind of crunchy politics I'm drawn to in Takahashi's work, so this is obviously the one that would appeal to me the most. but really they're all impressive in their own way. Arc 3 is minimalist and austere, with the desolate landscape of a planet Kiriko himself helped burn during his time in the military, providing a psychological reflection of his state of mind. And the final arc, God Planet Quent, is an impressive escalation of stakes, with the two warring militaries converging on this planet filled with ancient technology. It's very, very Dune-coded as well, which is quite fun. I think it's impressive that something so intentionally ugly and utilitarian in its aesthetic, in some ways more like British science fiction and what it looks like than what was popular in Japan at the time, was able to reach this level of success. And so why is that? Why has Votoms been in some ways kind of Sunrise's second mecha show next to Gundam? One might be tempted to say that it's simply down to the appeal of the mecha, and I think it's hard to argue with that entirely. Votoms carved out a niche of being the media franchise that would try and take real robot styles to their limit, at least before Patlabor, right? And it's a different style than Patlabor too. This is an aesthetic of machines as disposable and clunky and brutal. So in that sense, I think it was filling a gap in this developing niche otaku market. There was a desire for the grimy real robot series, and Votoms was that. And the scope dog, the central mecha, is just a beautiful design. The tri-lens on its face about as iconic as a Zaku's mono eye. To some degree, I think probably any series of these designs coming out at that time would have found some success. But come on, that's too easy. That's not what this channel is about. Let's look at why this thing works narratively. Like the original Star Wars, I think there's a certain working class appeal to the cosmology of Votoms. This is a show about people on the lowest rung of the galactic ladder, who, over the course of the story, act in rebellion to every power hierarchy there is. Kiriko defeats police chiefs, military commanders, and then religious leaders, and finally an AI who thinks it is God. So it's a story about the underdog prevailing. It's about the people who are seen as disposable, just physicalized scrap in a galaxy built for endless mechanized war, who nevertheless come to spit in the eye of an irate demiurge. The series has a visual fixation on characters reflected in lenses, as seen at the end of the OP, and this ends up being more meaningful than you might initially expect. In the last few episodes, Kiriko has to pretend to be Wiseman's successor, because as we learn, Wiseman is always watching. He's been watching the events of the whole series. He has eyes everywhere in this galaxy. But what does Kiriko do once he reaches its throne room? He shoots that god right in the face, and he dismantles its claim to authority, like he's done with every other despot in the galaxy. Even the title is a play on this. Votoms sounds similar in Japanese to bottoms, which is what the pilots of ATs are referred to as. That's right, it's a show about being a bottom and killing God, and that is a timeless tale. So with that in mind, let's look at these OVAs and think about what they do with the legacy of that very good initial series. Also, big show note, important stuff. Almost all the interviews and information in this that I consult are basically coming from one amazing source, that being Tim Eldred's website. Link in the show notes and on screen. Tim Eldred is the OG Western Votoms fan. He is an excellent cheerleader for the series and has been doing it for decades. He's been cheerleading the show since before I was born. His website on the series is filled with basically all the information you could possibly want on it. He even worked on a TV adaptation of the RPG Heavy Gear in the 90s, which is basically one big Votoms riff. If you want to go to the source for the stuff I talk about here, this is the place to look. Okay, so without further ado. The first OVA, The Last Red Shoulder, is 50 minutes long and debuted in 1985. It takes place between the first and second arcs of the series, and follows Kiriko as he teams up with the surviving members of his old unit, the Red Shoulders, to track down and kill their former commander, Pailsen. Overall, I really liked this one. It was produced close enough to the original that it retains much of the same feel, but as a single OVA, the visuals are considerably elevated. The Blade Runner inspiration for Wudo, or Wudo as I think it's now spelled, comes through far more clearly here, and the action is really impressive, with some quite artful use of light and shadow. It's all reinforced too by a very moody synthesizer score that feels very kind of John Carpenter inspired. How could you not love that? And this OVA introduces General Pailsen, who will be one of the major fixation across these. As a villain, he has a certain paternal, condescending quality as the father of the Red Shoulders. Combine that with him being voiced by Chikawa Otsuka, the Japanese voice actor for Charles Bronson and Peter Sellers, and he acquires a certain character actor texture that sets him apart. The second OVA, from just a year later, is less substantial. Battle of the Heterogeneous Species, or Big Battle, as it's more commonly known in English, has much of the same appeal as the prior OVA. Very nice animation and action, but narratively, it's an extremely slight affair. Basically a Monster of the Week situation. Tim Eldred's website tells me that this is somehow meant to be slotted between the final arc and its epilogue, but I would never have guessed this, and in reality, I would say it seems to take place in that same nebulous time frame a lot of 90s and 2000s Shonen Jump films do. A kind of narrative hammer space. By far, this is the OVA with the least meat on its bones, mostly just an excuse to see these characters again. But, you know, still good action, and I suppose it's fun that the enemy AT has a kind of xenomorph head in this one. And then in 1988, there was Roots of Ambition, another single kind of hour-long episode prequel, this time exploring how Kiriko ended up in the Red Shoulders. It's certainly got more to do narratively, but I have very mixed feelings about it on the whole. It starts this trend in these OVAs to really focus in on the perfect soldier idea from the original series. In one scene, soldiers attempt to shoot Kiriko point blank, only for the bullets to literally curve away from him. In my opinion, nah, this is not it. Not feeling it. It literalizes his invincibility far too much, which I think ends up betraying the underdog style that powers the series. The OVA still has some strengths, particularly aesthetically, but as a piece of world building, which is what this really mostly is, there's not a lot of emotional character stuff to work with here. Roots of Ambition begins a trend of narrowing Votoms' triaperture a little too much. And then we didn't have any Kiriko-focused OVAs for quite some time. In 1988, we got Meryl Link, the first Votoms project in which Takahashi was not involved. This is a Gundam-style OVA, a full-fledged side story with new characters on the edge of the conflict from the original. And it has a very fun gimmick. This is a series about someone hunting mechs without having a mech of his own, so we get lots of very interesting ways to tackle how would you take down a scope dog with just your meat body. It is mostly just a straight ahead action series, but quite a good one, and probably my favorite Votoms OVA up to that point. But it wasn't until the late 90s that there was another Kiriko OVA, and this one was the first sequel to the original show. In 1994, we got brilliantly shining Heresy, a 5-episode OVA. I was warned beforehand by a friend whose opinions on mecha I really respect that this is a love or hate situation. For me, it ended up pretty firmly in the love camp, but I think I do understand why Shining Heresy is so Marmite. What I appreciate most about it, especially compared to those earlier works, is its ambition. The story takes place 30 years after the original series. The idea is that since entering that deep freeze and killing God, Kiriko has become this mythological figure in the galaxy, viewed as both holy and monstrous. He's called the untouchable being. At the start of the series, he's awakened from deep freeze and soon discovers that Fianna, his love, has been taken by the religious order. But the story itself is less about Kiriko and more about Titania, the daughter of the frontrunner to become the next pope of the Martial Church, the setting's central religion that has adherents across both Gilgamesh and Ballarat. The current pope is nearing death, and a succession crisis is brewing, and the galaxy's religious hierarchy is descending into chaos. So the series is really about Kiriko getting closer and closer to basically what is like a Vatican planet, and the way that different people try to take advantage of that. As all this is happening, Titania's father attempts to manipulate events to secure the papacy, while Titania herself becomes increasingly fascinated with Kiriko. I find this all to be very juicy stuff. We have a whole new part of the galaxy that feels visually and texturally fresh. We have papal power struggles, which is a fun take on Takahashi's usual interest in political process. We have an almost entirely new cast, and it satisfies one of my major complaints about the original series. That being, needs more girls. Titania is basically Kiriko, if girl, but she's really cool. I like her quite a bit. In interviews, Takahashi says she was inspired by Ripley from Alien, which, yeah, duh, obviously. But I think that totally works. A kind of Ripley-style character fits perfectly into this world. Some very fun stuff with the lore is done as well. One of the first antagonists in the original show is Rachina, who ends up kind of trailing Kiriko across the galaxy, and he kind of goes insane over the course of that original show because he basically watches Kiriko, to him just this criminal, destroying every power hierarchy in that he's sort of dedicated his life to. And Rachina, he's like, I believe in order and structure and power and authority. And by the end of the series, he even like trails Kiriko to the throne room of God. And his last line in the show is he's like, you idiot, you've killed God. So where do you take that character after that? And what they do with him is completely genius. Rachina is now like a monk in like a monastic order, and he is the archivist on Kiriko. He's been driven insane to the point that he now basically worships Kiriko. Like, what an awesome idea. Chef's kiss. That's really spicy good stuff. And he views Kiriko, as this divine figure, but also as a poison. And he's kind of used in the show to parallel Titania, who herself is becoming obsessed with Kiriko. And as he says to her, you're being corrupted by the poison of Kiriko. That's awesome. Really good shit there. So yeah, I don't know. In general, I really enjoyed Shining Heresy. It feels like an actual expansion of the setting. It's doing new things. It's really cool, I would say. But I also understand why it's so divisive. The big one for me is it's just not long enough. In a perfect world, I think this would have gotten some sort of immediate sequel. But as it is, there's not really enough here to really properly characterize this new cast. Beyond that, I think this is a bit of an alien-free situation where your ability to enjoy it is kind of contingent on how you feel about it undermining certain emotional aspects of the prior work. So spoilers in an already very spoilery video. So in the original series, we've had 50 episodes building up to Kiriko and Fianna ending up together, sealing themselves in this cryogenic pod. And they're both kind of mirrors of each other. They're both these perfect soldiers, these kind of traumatized beings who are bred for war. This series ends with, sadly, Fianna has died coming out of cryogenic stasis. And I'm fairly sure the only reason they made that decision is they realized they liked Titania as a love interest better than they liked Fianna. And I get that because I also prefer Titania as a love interest, but I can't deny that this feels sort of contrary to the original work. Still, Brilliantly Shining Heresy is, for me, at the very least, the most substantial of the Votoms OVAs. It's trying to really set up a new Votoms story, but I think it would have basically needed probably like another 50 episode series to do justice to these ideas. And obviously, that did not end up happening. In fact, it was a very long gap until the next Votoms work. So the next animated Votoms project was Pailsen Files, a 12-episode OVA released in 2007. And this is another prequel series, another series basically about Kiriko being in the Red Shoulder unit. And it kind of brings you right up to the start of the first episode of the original show. Significantly, I actually remember this series coming out, and I remember there being quite a bit of hype around it in 2007. That was a very strange time to be a robot anime fan. We'd spent, half a decade with Gundam Seed and Gundam Seed Destiny, series that were very controversial in the English-speaking mecha fandom as kind of the dominant mecha series. And Gundam 00 was arriving that same year, so it sort of felt like the only viable form of mecha anime then and maybe forever would be that sort of sleek alternate universe Gundam model. And then, against that backdrop, Pailsen Files felt like a breath of fresh air. It was the first new Votoms anime in 13 years, and it wasn't interested in sanding down the rough edges of Votoms. The first episode makes a fantastic first impression too. It opens with this kind of Saving Private Ryan-esque homage as Scope Dogs storm a Normandy-like beach. It's a really good action scene, and I think it kind of set this feeling of like, oh, this is the real stuff. This is going to be a really solid OVA. It also features my favorite piece of music in the entire franchise. Its ending theme, Bye Bye Brother by Georgie and Aggie. This is a blues song that begins upbeat before transforming into a lament for comrades lost on the battlefield. It's really, really good stuff, and also set to imagery of regular soldiers in the Votoms universe. I would highly recommend listening to it. So, why does no one talk about Pailsen Files anymore? Well, it's pretty flawed in the way that most of these prequel OVAs are, but it kind of dials it up to 11. Not to be repetitive, but again, this thing is really focused on that perfect soldier idea. Most of the back half of this show is, again, just about exploring the perfect soldier idea and the kind of literal invincibility of Kiriko. Your mileage will probably vary on how much this affects your enjoyment of the work, but regardless, I do think it's too much of a focus. I understand, of course, that Kiriko's Chosen One status is already there in the original series, so there is a certain tension in the text between Votoms as a science fiction underdog story and a messianic one. But I think the difference is one of emphasis. In the original series, Kiriko only really becomes this messianic figure after he's already spent 50 episodes clowning on every authority figure he meets. People call him a perfect soldier, and then an overman, and Wiseman's chosen successor, and then in Shining Heresy, an untouchable one. But he has no interest in these labels, and consequently, neither really do we. They are designations imposed on him by a fascistic galactic order. Partially, I think, as a means to placate him. And, he just keeps on shooting. But Pailsen Files is really focused on Kiriko's specialness as its primary feature, which again also goes against that kind of grimy, militarized aesthetic it's going for. We're just meant to find Kiriko's specialness sort of fascinating in and of itself here, and I really don't. There is some nice action and interesting set pieces, but this really needed more of an emotional through line, I think, to justify its existence. I remember the compilation of this movie being shown at Scotland Loves Anime in, I think, 2011, the year that Takahashi came. And in his Q&A, he wryly remarked that Votoms and golf, he had mainly come, he told us, to play golf, were quite similar in that both are long and slightly boring. And that's a great line. Takahashi is a really charismatic guy, like gold star. He also was wearing entirely Scottish clothing. So he had like a tweed jacket on and a jumper, and he was like, oh, everything I'm wearing is Scottish. Super charismatic guy. Awesome. But the thing I would say is, I feel like he forgot that the original Votoms isn't dry and boring. It easily could have been, but I think by focusing in on Kiriko's headspace, his relationship to Fianna and his friends, and the constant plot progression towards Wiseman, it was actually very moody and exciting and dramatic. But Pailsen Files, at least when Scope Dogs aren't on screen, I do find pretty boring. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of this. Not a total disaster, but I do think it feels unnecessary. Not quite embarrassing, though, and that's more than I can say for the next Votoms work. Whoa, 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 it's everyone's favorite segment. It's the Patreon segment. Hey folks, thank you again to all of my Patreons for keeping this going. I've built a little bit of a backlog on there now, so there's various videos where I just talk about what I've been watching in a sort of more casual style, and I've talked about all sorts of things in those videos, like the most recent season of Panty and Stalking and City the Animation. It's a nice format, and I find it allows me to talk about stuff that maybe I don't have as much expertise on, but I still have sort of hot takes on. In terms of other housekeeping, I also have 2 short fiction publications this year. One is called Sad Mecha Girls, and you can read it right now in Flash Fiction Online. As you might imagine from the title, it deals with a lot of subject matter that if you like this channel, you will probably like or be interested in. It is sort of my ode to angsty teen mecha stories. And then in the science fiction podcast Biome, edited by the wonderful Alex Zubine, I have a story in one of those episodes. The story is called The Girl Who Shouted Yes at the Heart of Her Ship, and it is my kind of tribute exploration of the Sekai-kei genre. If you're not familiar, this is stuff like Saikano, Voices of a Distant Star. It's a kind of early 2000s, late 90s, lots of girls in sci-fi stories filled with ennui. But yeah, with that done, let's get back to the video. So Pailsen Files is 2007, and then 3 years later, in 2010, we get Votoms Phantom Arc, which is a sequel, this time to Shining Heresy, again directed by Takahashi. But when I say it's a sequel, that both is and isn't a little misleading. Yes, it takes place after that OVA, but it basically walks everything back. Titania is gone, she died on the way to her home planet, and the focus here, at least at first, isn't on Kiriko, but his friends Coco, Vanilla, Rushako, and Goto. They are looking for Kiriko, retracing the locations of the original show, which means, yes, you have a lot of characters walking into digipaint renditions of places from the original series and exclaiming, "Whoa, it's like nothing's changed." This happens basically every episode. I am sorry to tell you that Votoms Phantom Arc is awful. The total nadir of the Votoms series. The writing is lazy and expositional, the direction is Takahashi in his sleepiest mode, and the animation is, well, I mean, look at this. And plus, it's just really treading water. Shining Heresy did an excellent job of making you feel like the galaxy had changed in the 30-year time gap. But don't worry, in this one, it's all the same locations of the original series, mostly the same factions, people are wearing the same uniforms, you've got the same music in this thing, so nothing is different. Don't be afraid. Votoms is back. In an interview I found, one of the few interviews here not from Tim Eldred's website, Takahashi said he mainly made this in order to make sure Kiriko and Co were granted a happy ending. And on that level, I don't want to get too mad at Grandpa here. There are even moments in this that I find sort of endearing. Like at one point, Vanilla just turns to his wife Kokona and kind of out of the blue, he's like, "You're just so beautiful." And that's nice, you know, there's a certain kind of middle-aged gentleness here that I do appreciate, but I mostly can't pretend otherwise. This thing is just sort of bad. And as an ending, it doesn't even really function on those terms either. How does this thing conclude? Well, it turns out the Wiseman god from the original show isn't fully dead. And once again, he's been manipulating Kiriko over a bunch of events to arrive at his other throne room. And this time, he says, "Kiriko, okay, you don't want to be God, that's fine. But I've created this genetically engineered baby who will one day rule the galaxy. Raise them to be God." And Kiriko, for some reason, agrees to this, which doesn't really make any sense to me. But then he sets about killing Wiseman again in the exact same way he does the 2001, "I'm going to remove your data banks." And hilariously, Wiseman, the all-knowing AI, is surprised that Kiriko would do this. He's like, "Kiriko, what are you doing?" Which is like, well, it's the same thing he did in the original show, Armored Trooper Votoms from 1983 Wiseman. So this in itself is kind of a cliffhanger ending for, I guess, a sort of Lone Wolf and Cub, you know, Mandalorian and Groglet style story. And there is a novel sequel written along those lines by Takahashi himself. It's on Tim Eldred's website, and I love that he translated it, but I am absolutely not reading that. So quite an ignominious end to Kiriko's story. So ignominious, in fact, that in retrospect, it makes it hard for me to even want to recommend Shining Heresy. The original Votoms wraps everything up very nicely, and then Shining Heresy introduces a lot of interesting plot threads, but none of them get picked up. And then Phantom Arc introduces a space baby. Is there anything nice I can say here? A crumb of positivity? Well, the year this came out was the same year as another Sunrise Legacy sequel, Gundam Unicorn, which took half a decade to wrap up. A release model I'm not sure I'm fond of. By comparison, I think it's nice that this came out over just a few months, though of course you can tell. And then weirdly, we do have one more Takahashi OVA after this, the 50-minute Alone Again from 2011. This is an interquel set between Shining Heresy and Phantom Arc, designed to explain what happened to Titania. In some ways, I would say it's a less embarrassing note for Takahashi to go out on, just in the sense that I think the animation is better, the storyboarding is better, dialogue is slightly better, there's a better sense of mood, but it is also a very flawed object. Takahashi said in interviews closer to Shining Heresy coming out that Titania was meant to be Kiriko's love interest in further works. But then in interviews I found from when Alone Again came out, he said he basically regretted most of the decisions made in Shining Heresy, and that makes sense. Phantom Arc is mostly about stepping away from those decisions. So this thing sort of just exists to explain that Titania died before Phantom Arc began, but bizarrely, she's not even really the main character of this. She only really appears at the beginning, and then at the end she shows up and she dies. The rest is a pretty ho-hum, kind of a Western story, which is what a lot of these are, about Kiriko defending a town from some bandits. It really feels like a Western B-movie from like the 50s. And then Titania appears at the end and she gets some shrapnel to the gut, and then she's dead. So I think there's a pretty severe failure of imagination here. Like, this isn't Titania's story or anyone's really. She's just an excised plot element. And so the end result really is not that different from if they had just said, oh yeah, she died on the way to her home planet. And bizarrely, I would say this OVA doesn't really have a protagonist, because you would say it's Kiriko, but he's mute during most of this, and he doesn't really have any tangible motivations. So it does feel purely like a piece of housekeeping. Oh boy, pretty negative, huh? This is quite a sad petering out for a property that begins with a show I think is pretty great. Once again, OG Votoms is a very worthwhile mecha series. Absolutely worth a watch. It does a lot stylistically and thematically. And I'm going to give my thoughts on what I think sort of went wrong in these side works, but before I do, luckily it is not all disappointing. There are two mysterious, obscure, strange Votoms OVAs that no one ever seems to talk about. In 2011, we got two one-shot side story OVAs released as part of what I believe was called the Votoms Reborn project. The first of these is Votoms Finder, which is kind of an hour of riffing on the idea of what if Votoms had AUs like Gundam does. This is a more cartoony, vibrant take on the series. It's a setting where you have web-slinging armored trooperoids and these big insectoid skeleton dragon things. It also goes really hard in on the bottoms and top verbiage, so we get great lines like, "Us bottomers have no place there," and "You and your top, what exactly would you do up there?" Yeah, fun stuff. I dig that. Meanwhile, Case Irvine takes place in the central timeline, but with very 2010s character designs and direction. It is also really good and features a welcome return to 2D animation for the battles. If you find yourself put off by the cartoonish style of Finders, then I would recommend Irvine. Despite its newer character designs, the story is very faithful to the darker tone of the original show. It slots in there perfectly. I was really glad I finished this watch through with Irvine because it kind of encapsulated what I want to see more of from this franchise. It's a side story. It's basically this noirish boxing tale about a former child soldier that does some new things with its characters. Like, we have an early 2010s Moe girl here that would fit right into K-On! That's new for Votoms. But it also really respects the tone of the original show. Above all, it's a ground-level story, one that doesn't need universe-ending stakes or divine perfect soldiers to be interesting. You know, there's a million Sculpt Dog stories in this town, but this is just one of them. That's very much the vibe. It's also a story that actually tries, at least on some level, to have an emotional through line. The basic pathos here is that the main character, after getting back from a war, is earning money for him and his sister to get off this wrecked planet by fighting in armored trooper battles. But that's something he promised to her he wouldn't do. When she finds out and tells him the real Irvine never returned, honestly, it kind of hit me. Like, Takahashi always wanted Votoms to be a story about a traumatized veteran, and this is basically the first time the franchise has attempted to make that its central angle again since the original series. So these two OVAs are unusually good, especially Irvine. Like, I kind of demand an explanation for why these are so good. There's an energy and fun here that just wasn't in the other late period OVAs. Maybe it has to do with the series being such a closed garden for so long. Once it was opened up, you know, the people doing these had a real take and a real hunger to prove themselves. Finder's director Atsushi Shigeta is more of a key animator than a director, which sort of shows. It's fairly low on plot, but high on visual ideas and, you know, having a good time. He also worked on a lot of Ghibli films, so that's real talent. Meanwhile, Case Irvine shares a lot of credits with people who worked on Code Geass, and I find that fitting since I've often thought that Code Geass is kind of Votoms' biggest cultural descendant in terms of designs. A lot of the grunt mechs in Code Geass would not look out of place in this universe at all. Anyway, neither of these places seem to go anywhere. I get the impression both were probably backdoor pilots for some kind of larger project that didn't materialize. But still, they're a lot of fun. I would recommend them quite readily. It's pretty clear that the central issue here was the decision to focus in on Kiriko's story rather than expanding laterally. And Takahashi himself said in interviews that he was criticized for making the focus of these works too narrow. It might seem obvious now, you know, why do that? Why focus on Kiriko so much? But I think I understand the decision, at least in theory. While Votoms is an excellent series, there's a certain vagueness to its setting that is built into the text. The two factions, Gilgamesh and Balarant, are not the Earth Federation and Zeon. They're basically indistinguishable. And that's because the point isn't that they are meaningfully different factions with competing ideologies. No, the point is that they are two faces of the same twisted universe, locked in this pointless conflict that's being manipulated by a demiurge AI. Indeed, it's a plot point that the sides themselves barely remember why they are fighting. This is a pointless war. Ideology is not even really a factor here. This works great for that original narrative, but it also removes a lot of the side story potential that typically fuels this sort of military fiction. The original Gundam, by contrast, was particularly good at suggesting a much larger world existing just outside the frame. It does this through references to distant locations, previous battles, and parallel offensives, but also through a setting seething with competing perspectives and grudges. In just that original show, you have ideologues like Girin delivering speeches condemning the corruption of the Earth Federation, while characters like Bright Noah deride the fascism of Zeon. Kai Shiden constantly complains of an undefined Earth elite, while driving concepts of the show, like new type ideology, remain vague and contested. If Gundam's early world-building could sometimes be contradictory, that wasn't really an impediment to its success so much as fuel for the fandom fires, suggesting a living universe in which different people understood events in radically different ways. And it's all the more to explore in novels and OVAs and sequels. The most recent Gundam Hathaway film probably pushes this impulse as far as it can go, devoting significant attention to Gigi's boredom after securing a luxurious Earth villa. But even this satisfies a certain database mentality, depicting aspects of elite civilian life that the original series only gestured at. Votoms, in contrast, is a show in which the world building is laser focused to its thematic underpinnings in a way that is very effective for the story it's telling, but which doesn't doesn't really open it up to further material. I think you're faced with a decision in creating more Votoms, to either expand the world in some meaningful way, risking moving away from its core aesthetic and ideas, or to find some way to fill in gaps in Kiriko's story, a story that was quite well concluded by the series. Sadly, in focusing so specifically on the perfect soldier aspect and stretching it to its midichlorian-like limit, a lot of these OVAs ended up undermining the series' core appeal. It's not to say that I think these OVAs are disastrous. There are bits and pieces of compelling content here. The D-Day-esque intro to Pailsen Files, Shining Heresy is very good stuff. You know, there's some gold in their hills. But otherwise, despite all these sequels and interquels and prequels, I think the legacy of Votoms remains pretty heavily rooted in that original show. So with that in mind, how am I feeling about a new Votoms movie? Well, surprisingly, still pretty good. I mean, they got an actual director for this one. I'm not the biggest Mamoru Oshii sicko, but he's not a gun for hire, and I'm sure he'll do something with it, have some kind of take on the material. I suppose the thing to focus on is how to write more stories in this world without repeating the problems of these OVAs. Because, you know, scope dogs have appeal, this world has appeal, and I think even if this Oshii project were to be unpopular, not that I expect that, I'm just saying if that happened, I would still expect some more Votoms content further down the line. So, what would I want from further projects? I think they need to focus not just on the texture of these battles and machines, they have that down very well, but also on the world. What is life like in the Astragalus galaxy? What are its peculiarities that we could really hone in on in order to tell more personal, emotional stories? We know that there are religious societies here, so that might be something. What is the life like of a follower of one of these esoteric orders? What do they believe day to day? What are they fighting for? This is already a thread tackled in Shining Heresy, and it gives it a very interesting feel. Like I said, that sort of feels like the closest I've seen to if there was an anime adaptation of Warhammer 40k. There's lots there. The other thing that occurs to me are cybernetic transhuman themes. We know from the sequel OVAs that there are cyborgs in this world, so what is that like? Do they face discrimination? Are cybernetic attachments accepted, or is it ideologically contested? And how does this relate to the AI that was running everything? Was Wiseman accelerating this cybernetic convergence, or managing and preventing it? By the way, after I wrote this, I found out that this seems to be the focus of a very mysterious novel sequel by Takahashi from '93 called Equal Ganeshis, which, according to Tim Eldred, takes place about 300 years after the TV series, in a time when ATs and humans have fused together into androids called robo-tribes. So, you know, I'm not crazy. This is a place even the creators of the series have considered taking this universe. And my other big suggestion, more girls, more femininity, more sensuousness. If you're looking for something the original didn't do, that seems most obvious to me. We've had a lot of gruff military commanders and hardened mute men in Votoms. Of course, we do have witch in the title of this Oshii one, so maybe that is what we are getting. And most importantly, try to make an emotional connection. It is insane that one of my favorite pieces of Votoms content is now Case Irvine, the 50-minute one-shot with the Moe girl. But the thing is, they used that time to tell a pretty effective story about a soldier trying to help the people he loves, and that works, you know? That always works. Finding the emotional heart of the thing, finding the pathos. That's how you make the connection. Anyway, in conclusion, scope dogs are cool and kind of cute. They're the kind of robot you'd like to make. Look how they roller skate.